Hello everyone, Richard Wong here. Usually I review a lot of mirrors and DSLR camera gear, but today doing something slightly different, and I'm reviewing this Panasonic Lumix TZ220 compact camera. So this camera is also called TZ200 or TX2 or ZS200, depends on what country you are from. Panasonic really love to use very different names for pretty much exactly the same camera for different market. First, let me show you what the comparison between the widest angle to the longest angle is look like. So the basic design of the TZ220 and TZ110 are pretty much very similar. They both have a 1-inch sensor in it, and it has a very high power optical zoom, and overall you see it's a very compact camera. You definitely can put it into the pocket easily. Now the biggest difference between the TZ220 and the TZ110 is that the TZ110, the optical zoom is from 25mm all the way to 250mm, so it's a 10 times optical zoom, while this new TZ220 is from 24mm, so it's slightly wider, and it can zoom all the way to 360mm, so that's increased from a 10 times optical zoom to a 15 times optical zoom. But because Panasonic want to keep the overall dimension of the camera relatively the same as the TZ110, and you can't really cheat the laws of physics, so what they have to do is that they make the aperture of the lens slightly slower. So the lens is now a f3.3 to f6.4 maximum aperture lens, about half a stop slower than its predecessor. One of the biggest complaints about the TZ110 is that the body is quite slippery when you try to hold it, especially using only one hand. Now what Panasonic have done this time is that they put a little rubber grippy thingy here, and that does actually dramatically improve the grip of the camera. When I'm holding the camera just one hand like this, it feels very secure. So for the last 2-3 weeks when I was reviewing the camera, I actually didn't put any camera strap onto the camera. Yeah, don't tell Panasonic about that. And I still feel very confident even when I'm holding the camera using only one hand. Never once that I feel like, oh, I was about to drop the camera. So at the top of the camera, you can see there is the mode dial with the on-off button, and there's the shutter button with the zoom in, zoom out switch, and then there's the rear dial for you to adjust the shutter speed, aperture, whatever it is, depends on what mode you're in, and then there's also the video record button. Now there's also there's a ring that is integrated with the lens barrel, so that is like the secondary control ring. You can customize it to control other things. For me, I normally just set it to control the exposure compensation. So yeah, when I'm shooting in aperture priority or shutter priority, then I use the rear dial to control the aperture or shutter speed, and then use the front ring to control the exposure compensation. And the front ring feels very smooth as well. Now when I switch to full manual mode, the good news is I can still use the front dial to control the exposure compensation. But it feels a bit weird because I was expecting the front ring and the rear dial will be used to adjust the aperture and the shutter speed. Even though I have customized the front ring to adjust the exposure compensation. So what it means is the rear dial is used to adjust both the aperture and the shutter speed, and what I have to do is that I have to press the up button, and that will toggle the rear dial to control between the shutter speed and the aperture. Yeah, it just takes a little while to get used to it. So I would prefer if the rear dial actually has the clickable design, so that I can just click the rear dial and they will toggle between controlling the aperture and shutter speed, so my finger doesn't have to like reach the up button and then go back to the rear dial. Now on the side of the camera, you can find the HDMI port and also the USB port. There's no headphone jack and there's no mic jack on this camera. The camera using this very typical plastic rubbery cover to cover the two ports, but I really wish Panasonic put that sliding door design from the GX9 onto this camera, because that sliding door is just such a clever design. The touchscreen is very responsive, and overall the menu system is very similar to the Panasonic Lumix Micro Four Third cameras. I really enjoy controlling the camera through its touch interface. The TZ220 has a 0.53 times magnification EVF at the back of the camera. It is a little bit small compared to the other larger camera, but the resolution is pretty decent at 1240K dots, and it is a 3:2 aspect ratio panel that matches the sensor, which is also 3:2 aspect ratio. What it means is that when you are taking photo, the photo will be displayed at the full size of the EVF. So while the Sony RX100 Mark V has a larger and also higher resolution electronic viewfinder, I actually prefer the Panasonic implementation, which is simpler, because with the Sony RX100 Mark V, what you have to do is that every time when you use the electronic viewfinder, you have to put it up and then you have to put it back, and when you finish you have to push it back and then collapse it. So if you are shooting with the RX100V, I think after you repeatedly pop up the EVF and pull back the eyepiece, and when you finish you put it back for like 10 to 20 times during a short trip, I think you also prefer this more simple implementation. You basically just need to pull up the camera and then you can use the electronic viewfinder straight away. Now the TZ220 is not a weather sealed camera, and with its lens that would extrude and then collapse all the time when you turn on and turn off the camera, I would be quite reluctant to use it under rain. Having said that, I have used the camera a few times when I was out there and there was a bit of light shower, so there were quite a bit of rain drop onto the body and also the lens barrel, and it didn't cause any damage to the camera. So overall, the build quality and the design of the camera is pretty good. Apart from the few minor things I mentioned before, there's nothing major I would complain about the design and the build quality of this camera. TZ220's battery is rated at 370 shots per charge, so this is quite a bit better than the 300 shots per charge of the TZ110. In real life, I find the battery life of the TZ220 pretty okay. It's definitely not fantastic, but for everyday use, I think it is quite adequate. You can also use the USB port to charge a battery when you're out there traveling. But if you are planning to use this camera as a travel camera, I would highly recommend you get 1 or 2 spare batteries so that can keep it going for the whole day. Now next, let's talk about the image quality, and first let's talk about the image sharpness. The sensor sharpness is pretty decent throughout the whole focal length range. From 24mm all the way to 360mm, the sensor sharpness is actually pretty decent. Now if you look at the corners, then you will see the limitation of this 15 times optical zoom lens. At the widest focal length, you can see the corners are a little bit soft when you are shooting at maximum aperture. Fortunately, if you stop down, it does improve the sharpness quite a bit. When you start zooming a little bit, when you reach around 15mm focal length, then the corner sharpness starting to improve quite a bit. The corner seems to be sharpest at around 100mm, but if you keep zooming and all the way to 360mm, the corner sharpness still remain pretty decent. Now Panasonic has another compact camera, which is the TZ90. If you compare the TZ90 with the TZ220, you will see that the overall size dimensions of these two cameras are very similar. However, the TZ90 can go from 24mm all the way to 720mm, so that's double the maximum focal length of the TZ220. And this is because the TZ90 has a much smaller sensor, which is a 1/2.3 inch sensor, so that allows the camera to have a much longer reach with a similar body size. From wide angle to short telephoto, I would expect the TZ220 to give you much better image quality because of its 1-inch sensor, and also the optical zoom range is quite a bit smaller, so it should give you much better image quality than the TZ90. But what about if you are planning to take a lot of photo at very long focal length? Would the 720mm TZ90 give you better image quality than the 360mm TZ220? First, let's compare the image sharpness at 360mm, which is the maximum focal length of the TZ220. Now, if you look at these two photos, I would say there is very little difference between the two. TZ220 may be like a teeny tiny bit sharper than the TZ90, but in real life, I think you probably can't see difference when you are taking photo using either of these cameras. Next, let's look at the corners. Again, I think there is not much difference between the two cameras. I think the TZ220 is also slightly sharper, but again, the difference is really small. Now, the main advantage of the TZ90 is that it can zoom all the way to 720mm, which is double that of the TZ220. Now, what about if I crop the photo I took using the TZ220 at 360mm and then I upscaled it so that it's the same resolution as the photo I took using the TZ90 at 720mm? Let's look at the comparison photo now. Let's look at the center of the photo first. I would say there is virtually no difference between the two photos. The upscale TZ220 image looks pretty much identical to the TZ90 image. So if you look at the center, I would say there is no difference at all. Now let's look at the corners. Again, the crop and then upscale photo from the TZ220 looks pretty much identical to the TZ90. I cannot see any difference in terms of the sharpness or any artifacts. They look pretty much identical. Now, one thing I want to mention is I took all this comparison photo on a very bright sunny day, so all the photos were taken at base ISO. But if I retake this photo on a cloudy day or early evening, I would expect the photo from the TZ220 to be much higher quality than the one from TZ90 because of the sensor advantage. So what it means is, if you are buying a travel compact camera and you are happy to pay the extra price, then definitely go with the TZ220 despite its shorter maximum focal length. A compact camera with a high power zoom lens that is collapsible pretty much guarantee it would be a nightmare when it comes to distortion for both its optics designer and also the end user. And if you look at the photos from the TZ220, you can definitely see quite a bit of distortion throughout the whole focal length. And this is most obvious when you look at the photos shot at the widest focal length. But consider it is a very compact travel camera, I feel the overall distortion is still kept at pretty acceptable level. So have a look at these photos I took at various focal length and decide it yourself. The TZ220 has a macro mode just like the TZ110, and they have improved it so the minimum focus distance is from 5 cm down to 3 cm now, and this is at the widest angle. But with such a close focus distance, so you have to be really careful not to cast any shadow onto the subject that you are shooting. Now, because of such a close possible focus distance, you have to be really careful not to cast any shadow on the subject that you are shooting. But the good thing with shooting macro with this camera is that because it has a 1-inch sensor, so the depth of field is a lot deeper than cameras with a much larger sensor. You don't have to stop down too much, or you don't have to stop down at all when you are shooting macro photo, and you still have a reasonable depth of field to cover your subject. So next, let's talk about the ISO performance. I shot some sample photos from the base ISO all the way to the maximum ISO to show you the difference between the 1-inch sensor compact camera and the other 1/2.3 inch, which is the typical sensor used in most compact camera. I shot some comparison photo using the TZ90 as well, and I'll show you side by side so that you can see the difference between a 1-inch sensor and a 1/2.3-inch sensor camera. With the TZ220, I would say the ISO performance remained pretty decent from the base ISO all the way up to around ISO 1600. You can go up to ISO 3200 if you want, but the image quality was not that great. I would avoid shooting at ISO 6400 and ISO 12800 if possible. In comparison, the TZ90, because of its much smaller sensor, you can see the high ISO performance is definitely nowhere as good as the TZ220. From ISO 800 onwards, you can see the image quality already degrades significantly. So there's probably around 2 stop difference between the TZ220 and the TZ90 in terms of high ISO performance. TZ220 has pretty good lens flare control. Even when I'm shooting with a very strong light source directly in front of the camera or it's just outside the frame, I almost never see any very serious lens flare. The camera uses a contrast detection DFD autofocus system. The autofocus performance is pretty decent. The autofocus speed is fast. The transition is pretty smooth and doesn't hunt at all, especially during the daytime. Even when you are shooting moving target, the autofocus performance is still pretty good. So if you want to use the camera to take some photo at your kids' sports event, it should be okay. However, while I say the TZ220's autofocus performance is pretty good, and that is true when you are shooting on a bright day or even overcast day, because of its slow lens, when there is not enough light, the autofocus performance would start to drop quite noticeably. The autofocus speed would be a lot slower, and also occasionally it just hunt a lot before it managed to lock on to the target. I know a lot of people have questioned why Panasonic insists on developing and using DFD for autofocus system on their micro four thread camera, while most other competitors using hybrid autofocus system which combine the phase detection and contrast based detection system. One of the reasons I was told is that because the DFD system is pretty much purely software based, so it gives them the advantage of building one system and then they can apply it to pretty much any camera they are making. The TZ220 can capture Full HD video at up to 60 frames per second and 4K video at up to 30 frames per second. Videos are very sharp and it can handle challenging scenes relatively well for a camera of this class. I have repeatedly captured 15 minutes long 4K video using the TZ220 on a pretty warm 20-21 degrees Celsius afternoon here, and I have absolutely no overheating problem at all. The camera feels only slightly warm after I capture maybe 30 minutes or so of 4K video footage. There is a bit of cropping when you are shooting full HD video. Unfortunately, if you are shooting 4K video, then there is even more cropping. So look at this picture and then you can see how much cropping is applied when you are shooting video at different resolution. With the heavy cropping and there's no flip out screen and there's no external mic input, the TZ220 is definitely not a very good choice as a vlogging camera despite its compact size and decent video quality. If you are looking at buying a vlogging camera, check out the link below. I have another video that talk about a potentially very good vlogging camera that no one talk about. Continuous autofocus in video mode works pretty well. The autofocus speed is decent and the transition is pretty smooth thanks to the DFD autofocus system. Occasionally, the camera would stop responding or take quite a while before it would follow the object's movement. But fortunately, it doesn't really happen very often. Overall, I think the video autofocus performance is good enough for most users. Like most of the newer Panasonic Lumix camera, the TZ220 also support 4K photo mode. I'm not going to go through all the different 4K photo mode and features because there are just so many of them, and I have already talked about or demoed a lot of them in my previous Panasonic camera reviews. But one thing I want to talk about is a new feature called the sequence composition. This is actually a new feature that was introduced with the GX9, but when I was doing the GX9 review, in the end I didn't get around to demo that feature. So now this is a quick demo of this sequence composition feature. So basically you just capture a 4K sequence using the camera, and then you can go into the camera menu, go to the playback menu, and then you select the sequence composition, and then you select the 4K sequence that you have captured. And then what you do is that you can go through the whole sequence, and then you can mark the frame that you want to use to create this composed sequence photos. So yeah, let's go through and select a few of these photos. And after you select them all, then you can press the OK, and then the camera will always say it will take 1 minute, even though most of the time it takes way shorter than that. And after a little bit of wait, then it will create a photo like this, which you can see is a photo that is composed of multiple frames from your 4K footage. So yeah, this is something you can use Photoshop to do it yourself. But the whole point of the 4K photo mode is to allow user to do something like this very easily and quickly and all in camera, because not everyone know how to use Photoshop or have access to Photoshop. The Lumix TZ220 has built-in Wi-Fi and Bluetooth, and it's compatible with the 4.2 BLE, which is the Bluetooth Low Energy, and that means it allows the camera to have a constant connection with your smartphone or tablet, and that has very low power consumption. The constant Bluetooth connection means you can quickly and easily use your smartphone to remote trigger your camera, or use the smartphone's GPS to geotag the photos you capture using the TZ220 easily. For the more complex operation, for example the remote live view and other things, then you have to go through the Wi-Fi connection, which does take a little bit of time to set up and connect. Fortunately, Panasonic smartphone app is probably one of the most reliable and also well-designed smartphone app across all the camera brand. So yeah, it's still pretty good to use if you have to use Wi-Fi connection to do some of the more complicated stuff. I think it's not really a secret that compact camera in general is a shrinking market, but the 1-inch sensor compact camera is still popular among many different people, either people that want something better quality than their smartphone, or people that already have DSLR or mirrorless camera at home, but you know, when they are, for example, traveling, they don't want to carry the big camera, so they want something a lot more compact but still give out reasonably good image quality. Now there are normally two completely different approach to the 1-inch sensor compact camera. It's either something very small and compact, for example like the RX100 or the Sony RX100 series, which has a normal zoom, which is around normally like 3 times zoom, and very fast lens, f1.8 to f2.8 or something like that, and the camera overall is pretty compact size. And then on the other hand, you have something with a very high power zoom, for example like the Panasonic FZ series or the Sony RX10 series. So those have very high power zoom, but they are a lot bigger camera. Sometimes they are just as big as a DSLR. Now the Panasonic TZ220 and also its predecessor TZ110 is quite a unique camera because it is a very compact camera and it has a pretty high power zoom lens as well. Surprisingly, there's no other manufacturer that create a similar camera to compete in this area. Now, increasing the optical zoom from 10 times to 20 times while keeping the camera size relatively the same size is definitely a good move in my opinion. Personally, I'm very happy to give up half a stop of maximum aperture in return for this slightly wider and a lot longer optical zoom lens. However, what it means is that the TZ220 and to a certain extent the TZ110 is really a daytime camera, unless you bring a tripod with you. But bring a tripod with a compact travel camera kind of defeat the purpose, isn't it? Image quality wise, I think apart from the corners are a little bit soft and there is a bit of distortion at the widest focal length. Apart from that, overall there's not much I would complain about. I think Panasonic did a pretty good job consider the challenge they have with such a small compact camera with such a high optical zoom. High ISO performance is still also pretty decent. You can take photo up to 1600 ISO and you still get pretty decent quality image output. I'm a bit disappointed that the 4K video has pretty heavy cropping. But at least the video quality is pretty nice and I could take some long 4K video without overheating the camera, which is something a lot of its competitors failed to achieve. Price is probably the biggest reason that would stop people from buying the TZ220. After all, for the same price, you can almost buy a GX9 single body kit or some other similar mirrors or even DSLR cameras. So you think like, okay, I can get a mirrorless camera with a much bigger sensor and that give me better image quality. Should I buy that or should I buy the TZ220? Of course, the TZ220, the biggest advantage is huge zoom range. So even if you buy a GX9 and you buy like for example the 14 to 140 zoom lens, optional one, you pay more money to buy that. Overall total size is still a lot bigger than the TZ220. So I think in the end it's just a decision between like you want the best image quality or you want it to be able to fit inside your pocket that you can carry it anywhere. So in the end, I think it's a decision between whether you want the better image quality, then you go for a bigger camera, or you want a small compact camera like the TZ220 that you can fit into the pocket and then you can carry it around with you anywhere you want. Now, I recently just booked a family holiday to Japan later this year. I'm pretty excited about it and I have been thinking which camera should I take. The TZ220, after using it a while, seems to be a pretty attractive choice. I know that the picture quality probably won't be the same as my bigger camera, but its pocketability really is very tempting to me. So thank you very much for watching this video. I hope you like this video and found it useful. If you like this video, please give it a thumbs up, and if you haven't subscribed yet, please consider subscribing my channel because I got a lot out of similar video that will be coming very soon. So thank you for watching again and I will see you next time.